Today, right now, I'm going to talk about invisible things, but not things that just can't be seen. It's more like stuff after you've been around them for a while, they become invisible. Sort of like breathing, which we're all doing right now, hopefully. In and out, and in and out, because you're nervous that you're giving a TED Talk. And before I started talking about it, maybe you weren't thinking about it. Now that I've brought it up, you may be thinking about it a little bit too much, and it's starting to get a little bit weird thinking about this thing that you just never really consider, because normally it just happens. It's a natural process, and until some rando points it out, or until it becomes difficult or a problem, you don't really give it a thought. Going around our day-to-day lives, buying fruit, trying on shoes, paying our bills. I'm guessing that most of us don't really think about air or oxygen or breathing. These things are, in a certain respect, and more than literally, invisible. So this kind of thing happens to us a lot, and often within contexts and situations and processes that aren't as automatic or important as breathing. We become accustomed to things. The characteristics of our surroundings, the beliefs of our peers, abundantly available resources, our own habits. When you spend enough time in any particular context, these things, you habituate to them. You habituate to the general features of that context until they just seem unquestionable. And actually, I think we're seeing a little bit of a theme developing across a lot of the talks, that there is this sense that there are these things that if we don't question them, we kind of run into trouble. Your environment and ways of thinking about it, they start to become natural or given or invisible, even though they have an active and perceivable presence. It's just that being conscious of that presence is often weird or difficult or uncomfortable, or just mildly inconvenient. And so what we do is we kind of just let things fade into the background. And the invisible thing that I want to talk about today is networks. Groupings of unordered connections between many things that interact in many different ways. And eventually I want to talk about a distant and perhaps alternate universe future where they're not as prevalent or they're much different from what they are now. But to do that, I have to talk for a bit about their present. And to do that, I'm going to share an anecdote because I hear that's what you do during your TED Talk. So I was out with some friends a couple months ago, having some beers. We were having a conversation about the internet, and during the course of our conversation, which involved more than its fair share of Googling and checking Wikipedia and image searches and social media streams, I realized that we weren't just talking about the internet, we were also talking with it. And this, in and of itself, isn't really much of a revelation. There's been no shortage of ink spilled and TED Talk given on the benefits and supposed detriments of the internet's leakage into our meat space interactions. And here, I want to pause for a brief second to plead that everybody please stop perpetrating the internet versus real life dichotomy. The internet is not the opposite of real life. The internet is, in fact, very much real life, and it's a part of all of our conversations, at least for many, if not most people in this part of the world. Even if it's as subtle background noise or potential energy, it's there. And for the record, and for the most part, I think that this is great. I have no problem with it. I'm totally fine with it. So sitting with my friends, I became hyper aware of this, that the internet has this very natural and mostly unquestioned place in our interactions with one another and the world around us. And then one friend said something. He just said, "the network," in reference to the internet. That's it, just the network. Meaning the vast, global, interconnected system of countless machines that comprise all of the technology which lets us Google stuff and send emails and Instagram all of the puppies and all of the sunsets. The network. And everyone at the table, all of our friends, they all knew exactly what he meant. Now this probably goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway. There's more than one network. There's more than one kind of network. But the prevalence and usefulness of the internet and its related networking technology has made it, I think, in some sense, the preeminent network, the paradigmatic network, the network. And to a large degree, I think that this has also influenced the way that we look at the world. Beyond all the things that we normally credit the internet with changing, education, entertainment, history, science, the arts, social interaction, maybe it's also encouraged the growth of what we might call network vision, the ability or willingness to perceive networks, which I think there's at least anecdotal support for a claim that we do. Even outside of Facebook, I consider my social network. No matter how many emails y'all send me, I'm never going to join LinkedIn, but I see some email receivers also in the audience. I definitely think of my professional network as exactly that. The talk of the recent Ebola outbreak was couched in language about the global transportation network. Cultural and physical violence is perpetrated all over the world by terrorist networks. Environmental concerns are often described in terms of networked ecosystems. The global economic collapse was the result of poorly managed financial networks. Arguably, the height of this thinking is in Christopher Vitale's 2014 book, Networkologies, which develops a kind of network ontology. He moves beyond Cartesian dualism, which is the separation of the mind and the body into two distinct entities, by suggesting that our consciousness meet, and all of the experiences which unite the two are in fact networked. That we, in our very being, are somehow networks. And I love this idea. I think that this is great and interesting. And I want to stress that I'm not saying viewing the world as a network of networks is necessarily detrimental. On the contrary, network vision gives us new perspectives on old problems. It brings new consideration to familiar relationships. Network theory and its parent area of study, graph theory, has developed models and techniques and systems for dealing with massively, massively complex situations. I'm simply curious if the prevalence of the internet and its prevalence as a network has made the world more network-like somehow. I think the answer is both yes and no. We could argue that network vision has trained us or allowed us to see things which have been there the whole time. We just weren't looking, or we couldn't. Take, for instance, a wolf and its surrounding environment and all of the organisms in that environment. Seeing these things as networked allows us to approach a complex and always shifting arrangement of disparate parts as a unified system with connections and boundaries that can be identified and studied. But it's also worth considering how new technology is frequently used as a metaphor for our experience of the world. After the Industrial Revolution, we started talking about the machinery of the body. The telegraph influenced all kinds of communication about communication. In 1633, Descartes wrote about how the function of the mind was not unlike hydraulics. And today, we would say that our brains are like computers. So now, while that wolf may or may not actually be networked in some sense, I do get the impression that the word network generally is used as less of a thumbtack, pinning down a specific or particular thing, and more of like a sledgehammer, just getting the most amount of work done with minimal effort, which is great, because meaning is hard, we're gonna get at it however we can. Our relationships and the relationships that we perceive between things, they've always been elaborate. And network has become the metaphor of choice for doing the job of explaining those relationships with minimal effort. But where are the boundaries of this concept and its meaning? Like, what do we call a network, but it's not, technically? Not because I want to go to parties, and when someone says that something is a network, I can be the guy who's like, well, actually. But because the metaphors that we use guide our thinking about what's actual and what's possible. They're very, very powerful stuff. And also, on the other side of this coin, what do we call networks? And sure, maybe those things are in fact networks, but we should be kind of upset about that. We should want them to be more than networks. We should want them to be whatever comes after networks. Which brings us to the question that we saved earlier for later, except now is later. What comes after networks? Technologically, conceptually, metaphorically? Will we, like Descartes' hydraulics analogy, eventually look back upon our network metaphor for relationships between groups of things and say, ooh, really? Yikes. Sort of like when you look at pictures of yourself from high school? Maybe not, but maybe so. And if so, what is the realization or the technology that's going to underscore how much nuance our current network metaphor lacks? So, towards that end, I kind of want to try, all of us, doing the impossible, which is to look past this thing that seems so natural and so given that it's weird to talk about it. It's weird to talk about what comes after it. It's like talking about what comes after breathing, because it's so natural and so reflexive. Except networks aren't breathing. They're something else entirely. And it's when you don't start asking these questions about these things that aren't necessarily naturally occurring that you can take them for granted and that they become this weird kind of insidious. And so we're going to try to imagine some speculative mode of interconnection that may eventually replace or complement the network. It would adopt some of networking's fundamental characteristics like connections, relationships, multiplicity, but it would ignore or get rid of some others. And to figure out which others, we might ask, what about networks could be viewed as shortcomings? What about them are wrong? Where is the friction in networks? And then how do you remedy those shortcomings? This could be the gateway to our piece of fantastically speculative alternate universe interconnection, the post-network. So that's what we're going to do. We're all going to speculate together. All I need you to do is to imagine a network. Technological, social, biological, infrastructural, neurological, your group of friends, your networking system at home. Ideally something that you know well. And as we talk about networks and network shortcomings, and what the post-network remedies to those shortcomings might be, try to imagine how this thing that you're holding in your brain might compare. Is it definitionally a network? Or is it one of those things that we call a network because the sledgehammer is just really easy? What if it is a network? And if it is, how does it respond? Being asked to do new and weird, unfamiliar things. It might be able to adjust, it might not. We all may end up confronted with pure nonsense, which is something I am perfectly prepared for. Nonsense is a necessary byproduct of speculation, and we are about to speculate with a couple capital S's. So, network frictions. We're going to talk about 3. The first is that your network always wants to grow. Even if your network is private or exclusive or contained, it still requires growth in some sense. It's just kind of a jerk about it. And that's the case because your network is most powerful when it grows because networks amplify action. Your network doesn't act on its own, right? It allows the things that it connects to take action or amplify the actions that they would naturally take. And its ability to do this is based on its size. Part of how and why this works is that your network doesn't foreground the individual characteristics of its nodes, only how those nodes, those things that it's connecting, operate in a larger context. It's like when I send an email from Vienna to New York, the characteristics of the servers that email passes through, they don't matter beyond the ability to perform that task. Your professional network is more effective the more people that you know, the more people who are in it, but as demonstrated by a really famous sociology paper in 1973, you're actually more likely to get a job from the people that you know less well, and in part that's because you just happen to know a lot more of them. Network size has a greater effect than substance in a lot of ways. So the post-network may focus on a different kind of strength, not allowing action, but encouraging it or inspiring it, not functioning despite the individual characteristics of those comprising the network, but because of and in concert with them, which is very much related to friction number 2. Sociologist Bruno Latour said that network connections leave empty that which is not connected. So whatever your network doesn't connect to is empty. It's not background space, but it's actual nothingness from the network's perspective. Think about, like, what does a soup dumpling have to do with your network of friends? What does an orange have to do with your home computer network? Those things aren't just unrelated, they're unconnectable. They seem completely foreign. So spaces which don't enable your network to act, they're useless, they're ignored. And the post network could attempt to cultivate connectivity where there is none. It could somehow address its phobia of non-networkable areas. If the post network encourages action, then maybe it encourages the creation of inroads to this weird negative space. The post network may be a true crisis of networks in that it allows us to suddenly realize with great accuracy and great urgency what and where the network is, sure, but also where it isn't. I think a lot of the problems that we come across, that we've been talking about in the talks today, have to do with things that we view as non-networkable. Places in the world, even people, seem like they don't connect to what we generally think of our network, our social network, our societal network, our infrastructural network. We see those things as non-networkable. So not to sort of crassly over-intellectualize this really strange talk about networks, but I think that this actually does factor into the sort of the social fabric, the stuff that the important stuff that we're trying to deal with every day. And this brings us to the final network friction, which is a list not meant to be exhaustive in any way, only hopefully encouraging, maybe a little confounding. Your network replaces the shape of our world with its own. Networks don't necessarily map or sit on top of our geography. They ignore it to create their own shape. Uninterested in geographic and physical location, networks possess their own ever-shifting, indeterminate structure, which Christopher Vitale calls immanent, a shape which is always already emerging as connections are made and broken and overall structures are reconfigured in the maintenance of the holy grail of networks, stability. Meaning, nodes within your network, they're never sure of their position. A constantly shifting structure means that there's no location in a network, only a kind of motion around and inside of it. Nodes don't and can't know where they stand within a network. This information is both unimportant and, to a certain degree, impossible. So even though the network envelops us, is all around us, envelops things that it connects, it is also, in a sense, invisible. The post-network, then, could, above all things, somehow be visible. Thanks.